The sound of laughter echoed across the glass-enclosed university courtyard as the students, dressed in their designer clothes, looked disdainfully at the girl who arrived late, panting, the bike chain still etched into her leg. The contrast was stark. She, with her hastily tied hair, her worn backpack, and her sweaty hands, trying to make her way through the crowd. They, huddled in expensive imported cars parked all around. One of the girls in the circle pointed and commented loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Look at that, it's like we're in another century. Who still rides their bike to class?" The laughter grew louder, and one of the boys added, "You've got to be joking. She must have gotten lost on the way to cleaning." She gripped the handlebars tightly, her face burning in silence. Behind the mirrored glass of the building, a man watched the scene without moving, his eyes fixed on the humiliated young woman as if he knew something no one else there could imagine. Minutes. Later, in the main auditorium, the scene reversed. The same group that had been laughing at the girl was called to the presentation of a special guest, a mysterious millionaire, famous for investments no one fully understood. When he took the stage, silence was immediate. His voice was firm, controlled, but there was a hidden warmth. He scanned the auditorium and, upon spotting the girl sitting in the back, paused for a few seconds that seemed eternal. Then, unexpectedly, he announced, "Before we begin, I want to introduce the most important person in this room. She is the real reason I'm here." All eyes turned, and the same girl who moments before had been the butt of jokes was now being singled out by the millionaire himself. Shock ran through the audience like a lightning bolt. He knew who she was, and what's more, he was about to reveal a truth that would change everything, including the fate of those who had laughed at her. If this story has already captivated you so far, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. The morning began cold in New York, with a heavy sky that seemed to promise rain at any moment, and the private university, imposing like a modern palace of glass and marble, filled with young people who seemed to live in another world. Luxury cars parked one after the other, engines purring like a rehearsed orchestra, each student alighting impeccably dressed, cell phones in hand, and smiles practiced to impress one another. It was an environment where vanity was not only cultivated, but demanded. There everyone measured themselves by what they wore, what they drove, and above all, how much they could flaunt. The campus felt more like a fashion show than a place of learning. Among the groups scattered across the lawn and hallways, some students stood out. They were the children of the elite, those who dictated invisible rules and whose laughter could make or break someone's reputation in seconds. They were admired, envied, and feared. Among them, however, there was a presence that stood out completely, like a blemish in an otherwise perfect painting. She was pedaling her simple bicycle, its brakes squeaking, her breath quickening after climbing the hill to campus. Her clothes were modest, unremarkable, except for their stark simplicity in contrast to the surrounding wealth. Her backpack was worn, her sneakers ancient, but her eyes, despite her fatigue, held a quiet steadfastness. It was as if she knew that every look of contempt couldn't define who she was inside. Even so, there was no escaping the laughter. As she crossed the central courtyard, the jokes began to echo. One of the girls in the expensive dress and sweet perfume whispered too loudly, "Isn't this a delivery parking lot?" The group laughed in unison, and one of the boys, the son of a real estate mogul, added, "Be careful. She might scratch the cars with that old bike." The laughter spread cruel, even among those who didn't have the courage to say anything. She continued on without responding, only gripping the handlebars, but the flush on her face betrayed the pain she was trying to hide. It was like this almost every day, but that morning there was something different, a tension in the air no one could explain. From the top of the glass-enclosed balcony, the man watching seemed unnoticed, as if he were part of the scene. Tall, impeccably dressed, with a perfectly adjusted tie and a watchful gaze, he watched the humiliation in silence. He wasn't a professor nor an ordinary father. He was a name that circulated in newspapers, in economic forums, and in conversations about unattainable fortunes. He didn't mingle, he didn't smile in public, But that morning, his eyes had found something in the girl's figure that no one else could see. There was no pity in his expression, nor surprise. There was recognition, as if this scene had been written beforehand, and he was just waiting for the right moment to enter. The campus. Routine continued. The bells rang to announce the next lecture. The groups dispersed between selfies and superficial conversation. But something invisible was beginning to take shape in the air, something that would transform this seemingly cruel comedy into a drama of unimaginable proportions. While the girl parked her bicycle in the most hidden corner, trying to disappear, the millionaire descended the internal stairs with firm steps, as if he carried with him a revelation that could shake not only that place, but every life that had laughed at her seconds ago. Her past wasn't written in luxurious books or smiling family photos hanging on decorated walls. It was a past marked by the daily struggle to exist in a world that seemed to have no place for those born without privilege. She grew up in a forgotten neighborhood, where the houses were small and the streets potholed, lit by barely functioning streetlights, and where the sound of police sirens was more common than the sound of carefree laughter. From a young age, she learned that nothing would come for free. Her mother, a seamstress who worked long hours, sewed not only clothes but her very survival with every stitch. Her father had disappeared before she was even 6, a silence that never found an answer. Only vague memories remained of a figure who would never return. She grew up with the absence, with the constant feeling that something was missing, and with the pain of seeing her mother aging too quickly, consumed by the exhaustion of keeping the house afloat. When the other children arrived with new backpacks at the start of the school year, she would show up with repurposed notebooks and worn-out pencils. When they talked about family trips, she would just smile silently, keeping to herself the reality of never having left the same city. The world taught her strength early on. She worked odd jobs from an early age, cleaning houses, helping out in grocery stores, caring for elderly neighbors for a few coins. She was the daughter who never complained, but who cried silently when the nights were too long. There were no grand birthday parties, just improvised cakes her mother made with leftovers from the pantry. Yet, within her, there was a flame that never faded. The desire to transform that reality, not just for herself, but for all the times her mother would whisper, "You'll go far, my daughter. I know." Those words were both comfort and burden, for she carried on her shoulders the hope of a woman who had sacrificed everything. Admission to university was almost a miracle, the result of late nights spent in front of books borrowed from the public library and scholarships earned through merit, not by her surname. There, among young people who had never felt hungry, she was seen as an intruder, as someone who stood too far outside the elite image cultivated by that place. But what no one knew was that behind that girl's tired eyes lay a brilliant, determined mind that understood life, with a depth none of them could have imagined. Her pain had transformed into discipline and her loneliness into silent observation. She had learned to listen more than talk, to observe more than show off, and that was precisely what made her so different. There were days when she wondered if she could endure so much contempt, if the effort was truly worth it. But then she remembered her mother's calloused hands, the faith she placed in her journey, and she kept going. Even though the world tried to strip her of her dignity, even though the laughter echoed in her head when she arrived on her bicycle, even though the stares reduced her to nothing, she kept a secret within herself that no one suspected. Her humble origins, her life of pain and sacrifice were not marks of shame. They were silent weapons shaped by time, which would one day be turned against those who humiliated her today, unaware that fate, patient and cruel, was already preparing the scene for her turnaround. That week, the entire university seemed to revolve around a single event, the special lecture that would bring together students, faculty, and invited investors in the grand auditorium. It was the perfect opportunity to display not only intelligence, but also status, because there the spotlight didn't just illuminate speeches, but also clothing, gestures, and surnames. The most popular groups were already gathering in the hallways, planning who would sit in the front rows, who would ask clever questions just to impress, and who would get the best photo for social media. Among them was the same group that turned the girl's life into a field of daily humiliation. The leader, the son of one of the city's biggest businessmen, took a sick pleasure in testing how far her stamina would endure the ridicule. It was his idea that spread like wildfire among his colleagues to turn her presence at the lecture into a spectacle of derision. "If she has the courage to sit in the front rows, I'll buy everyone dinner this week," he said, with that smug smile everyone knew. Laughter erupted, and the bet soon gained momentum, passed from mouth to mouth, growing in versions and exaggerations. Some said she wouldn't even dare enter the auditorium. Others swore that if she did, she'd play the role of class mascot. Each comment was an invisible but profound cut. They weren't interested in intelligence, merit, or future. They simply wanted to diminish someone who bothered them simply by existing, in a space they believed to be exclusive. On the morning of the event, the atmosphere on campus was already one of anticipation. In the hallways, whispers carried the venom of curiosity. Is she really going? I bet she won't show up. And if she does, it'll be so funny. The girl knew everything. The rumor had reached her as it always did, through the narrow hallways where no one dared to look at her, but everyone spoke loudly enough for her to hear. She pretended to ignore it, but each word stuck like a stone inside her. That day she pedaled slower than usual, as if she weighed more than usual. As she passed through the university gates, she felt the stares piercing her, some with contempt, others with the cruel anticipation of those waiting for a spectacle. She parked her bike in the usual corner, adjusted her worn backpack on her shoulders, and continued on, determined to face whatever lay ahead. The auditorium was already full, and the seats closest to the stage were occupied by those vying for the spotlight. In the back rows, the empty space seemed to offer her refuge, but at that moment she knew that retreating would mean handing over the victory they so desperately desired to others. She took a deep breath, her fingers trembling, but she moved slowly toward the front rows. The buzz began almost immediately. Whispers, giggles, exchanged glances. One of them even took out his cell phone to record the scene, as if preparing for a grotesque show. The leader of the bet, sitting cross-legged, smiled triumphantly, muttering loudly enough for everyone to hear. "And isn't she really here? Poor people's courage is truly funny." More laughter. She sat firmly, without looking to the sides. Inside, her heart felt like it wanted to explode, but her eyes remained fixed on the still empty stage. No one knew it, but that simple choice, to sit at the front, was more than an accepted challenge. It was an act of silent resistance, a gesture that, unbeknownst to her, would set in motion the wheels of a destiny that would humiliate not her, but all those who believed that power was measured by money and surname. The auditorium was abuzz with anticipation, a mixture of collective anticipation and arrogance. The lights dimmed, and the presenter's voice echoed through the room, enthusiastically announcing the presence of one of the country's most influential investors, a man few there had ever seen up close. The millionaire appeared on stage with firm, controlled strides, wearing a suit that needed no logo to command respect. His gaze seemed to pierce through the crowd, and the silence spread in waves as he walked to the center. The entire room exuded the reverence one feels before someone unattainable. But while everyone shifted in their seats, trying to appear more sophisticated than they actually were, he didn't look to the crowd for admiration. His eyes, almost instinctively, found her in the front row. For a second, just a second, which, to her, seemed to last an eternity, the entire world vanished. The sound of cell phones, the whispers, the ironic glances disappeared. There was only that man watching her with an intensity impossible to disguise. She quickly looked away, clasping her hands in her lap, trying not to show the tremor she felt. She had never been so close to someone of that stature, someone who seemed to carry not only wealth, but power. And yet, there was something strange about the way he looked at her. It wasn't the distant, superior look she was used to receiving. There was a recognition, as if this scene held an intimate meaning only for him. The millionaire began his speech, and his deep voice filled the room. He spoke about innovation, about the future, about resilience. The words sounded inspiring to the audience, but to her, Each sentence seemed charged with a double meaning, as if speaking directly to her story. With each pause, he returned to look at her. The tension was almost unbearable. The colleagues around him began to notice. One of the young men nudged the other and whispered, "Did you see? He's looking at her." Muffled giggles arose, but now mixed with something new, a hint of discomfort. It was as if, suddenly, this girl who had been the butt of jokes had received attention no one there would have dared dream of earning. At the end of the talk, silence hung over the auditorium like a broken spell. Everyone expected applause, but before he could finish, the millionaire did. Something unexpected. He walked to the edge of the stage, his eyes fixed on her, and said, I need you to come here." Her heart raced. For a moment, she thought she'd heard wrong. The entire auditorium turned to her like an army of incredulous eyes. The girl hesitated, but the encouraging applause, mixed with venomous whispers, pushed her forward. She climbed the stage stairs, each step echoing like thunder in her mind. When she reached him, she felt the imposing presence of him almost physically. He held out his hand, firm and sure, as if he already knew her. The touch was quick but charged with something she couldn't decipher, and before everyone, he simply said, "This young woman is living proof that courage is priceless." The audience froze. Those words, coming from whomever they came, carried the weight of a sentence. She, the girl on the bicycle, was suddenly the center of something no one there understood. But for him, that was just the first move in a much larger game. A game that would soon reveal closely guarded secrets. The university hallways had never been so bustling. The fact that the millionaire had called her onto the stage in front of everyone had spread like wildfire. Within minutes, it was impossible not to hear comments. Some murmured that perhaps it was a simple gesture to illustrate his speech. Others insinuated there must be something more, strange, maybe even ridiculous, between them. Student social media was already flooded with short videos, photos of her next to him on stage, cruel memes created in a matter of seconds. The same courage he had extolled was now twisted into a joke. She walked across campus with her head held high, but each step seemed heavier, as if carrying a multitude of mocking voices at her back. When she entered the campus cafeteria, the silence that followed her was piercing. At a table in the back, the most popular group was already waiting for her. The leader, the one who had created the bet, clapped. Slowly, with a venomous smile. "Congratulations," she said theatrically. "Our star of the auditorium has arrived." Laughter erupted. She clutched her tray tightly, trying to ignore it, but the teasing continued. "It must be nice to be chosen by the millionaire just because you seem authentic," one of the girls said with mock innocence. "Or do you have some trick up your sleeve? Maybe you do special jobs after school." The laughter that followed was cruel, cutting. The words, laced with venom, echoed throughout the room. Some pretended not to hear but couldn't hide their muffled smiles. Others discreetly filmed, hoping to capture her reaction. And it was at that moment that the humiliation reached its peak. The leader stood up, approached her, and loud enough for everyone to hear said, "Let's be honest, do you really think someone like him would notice you? Do you think you're different just because you got on stage? Wake up. You'll never stop being the girl on the bike, the outsider in this world. This is nothing more than a joke we'll all forget in a few days." The silence was immediate. It was as if he'd poured gasoline on the fire. She stood still, her eyes fixed on him, her heart on fire. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run away. But she took a deep breath, placed the tray on the nearest table, and simply stared at him. She didn't say a word, but the steady gaze she gave him pierced his arrogance like an invisible blade. It was a brief moment, but it made him shiver inside, even if he didn't let it show. The group laughed again, but now the sound seemed forced, uncomfortable. The people around them looked away, some out of embarrassment, others out of fear of becoming the next target. She walked away slowly, with the same silent posture, but inside she carried the pain as if it were an open wound. What they didn't know was that the humiliation would not be forgotten, not by her, and especially not by him, the millionaire who had watched everything. From afar, motionless, but with a hardened expression, as if already planning the right moment to return to the world, the weight of every word spoken against her. That public scorn wouldn't be the last scene. It was merely the prelude to a twist no one there dared imagine. The following days were like a bitter repetition. The video of the scene in the cafeteria spread through the hallways, edited, distorted, with malicious captions that reinforced the idea that she had tried to show off, and that the millionaire's choice was nothing more than a stroke of luck or pity. But what no one knew was that behind her silence, there was a watchful, calculated gaze that saw every detail clearly. She knew more than she let on. She knew about the bet. She knew about the planned laughter. She even knew about the comments posted anonymously on the university forums, which weren't so anonymous after all. What others didn't understand was that she wasn't naive. She had learned early on to read people, to recognize patterns, to grasp the logic behind their masks. Every cruel word, every stifled laugh, every cell phone raised to capture her humiliation were pieces of a puzzle she was silently putting together. One rainy afternoon, fate decided to lay its cards on the table. A group project forced her to meet with some of the same people who had led the mockery. They sat in a glass room where everything seemed to echo. She calmly heard every word laced with sarcasm, but didn't react, until one of them, impatient, decided to provoke, "Did you really believe that act on stage, that the millionaire was serious?" It was then that she looked up, for the first time looking at everyone without wavering, and said, with a calmness that disconcerted them, "You think you know everything, but you don't realize how predictable you are. Do you think I don't know about the bets? That I haven't heard every hidden comment in the hallways? Do you think I don't know who posted every video, every joke, every ridiculous caption? I know everything, and I know more than you imagine." Silence was immediate. They looked at each other uneasily, trying to mask their discomfort with nervous laughter. But there was something in her voice that didn't sound like an empty threat. It was a conviction that came from someone carrying profound truths. One of them tried to regain control. "You're bluffing. You have no proof." She simply smiled, without responding, letting the emptiness of doubt eat away at each of them. The air grew heavy. For the first time, the group that had always seen her as a target began to feel genuine discomfort, as if they were facing someone observing from above, not below. She stood up and, before leaving, added, "You underestimated me because it's easier to laugh than to see. But life takes its toll, and believe me, I always knew this day would come." The door closed behind her, and the silence remained. The laughter that used to dominate those meetings was no longer there. They didn't know the extent of her knowledge, but they knew for the first time that perhaps they weren't the masters of the game. And in that moment, without them realizing it, the humiliation began to change direction, like a tide preparing to forcefully return everything it had received. That night, after the lecture, the millionaire remained on campus longer than usual. It wasn't common for him to waste minutes on trivial conversations or linger in places that offered no strategic advantage. But there was something about that young woman that stuck with him, something that tugged at him like an unsolved enigma. He could recognize faces, memories, barely buried stories. And hers. There was something about it that awakened a distant, almost forgotten memory. Intrigued, he discreetly asked his assistant to gather information about the student. It wasn't long before the reports arrived. Her name, her impeccable academic record, the scholarships she'd won, her history of financial hardship, the neighborhood where she'd grown up. Every detail seemed to paint a narrative of pain and resilience, but there was one part of the report that made his heart race: her mother's name. Reading it, he felt as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. That name, simple and familiar to anyone else, carried for him the weight of an old debt, a wound that had never healed. It was the name of the woman who, years ago, had helped him through the darkest days of his youth, when he had no fortune, no status, only an uncertain future, and the wounded pride of someone who had nearly lost everything. He remembered her sewing in silence to help him survive. He remembered the hot coffee left on the table when he no longer had the strength to carry on. He remembered her firm words, Get up, you were not born to give up. That woman had been his safe haven, and he had never had the chance to repay her. The world, in its haste, had driven him away from her. And now, before him, stood her daughter. It was no coincidence. It was destiny. The millionaire closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that revelation. The girl everyone humiliated was heir to the kindness that had once saved him. And not only that, in her determined eyes, in her silent courage, he saw reflections of that same woman who had taught him the value of dignity, even in poverty. Yet the shock was not just of recognition, but of shame. He, who had watched her humiliation in silence, who had allowed the laughter to linger before intervening, now realized how blind he had been. This wasn't just about defending her. It was about settling accounts with his own past. The next day, when he saw her again crossing the campus on her bicycle, he felt a mixture of profound respect and discomfort. It was as if her every pedal stroke was a silent accusation against all who belittled her, including him, who had kept the revelation to himself without yet having the courage to share it. Watching her was like looking into a mirror that revealed not only who she was, but also who he had been and who he had ceased to be. For the first time in a long time, the millionaire felt the weight of a simple truth. His wealth, his influence, his titles, none of it erased the silent debt he carried. And now, faced with the daughter of the woman who had once extended her hand to him, he knew he could no longer hide behind indifference. The past had caught up with him, and the secret he had uncovered would transform not only her life, but his as well. After the revelation that had hit him like a blow, the millionaire could no longer act the same. For days, his attention, previously divided between meetings, contracts, and million-dollar negotiations, constantly focused on a single point: her absence. Because suddenly she was no longer there. The bicycle that always rested against the campus wall had disappeared. The empty bench in the front rows, which everyone mocked, now seemed a monument to what no one had the courage to admit. Her presence had become essential. At first, many students laughed, believing she had simply given up, that she couldn't bear the weight of the humiliations. "See, it was only a matter of time before she ran away," they would comment, masking their discomfort with sarcasm. But as the days turned into weeks, the feeling of emptiness was no longer just hers. It began to affect them. The jokes lost their charm, the hallways seemed quieter, and even the arrogant looks began to grow uneasy. The millionaire, however, felt something much deeper. His luxurious routine, full of important commitments, was tainted by the absence of that young woman who, without him realizing it, had become a constant reminder of something money couldn't buy: authenticity. He began to see her shadow around every corner. The sound of bicycles on the street made him turn his head, hoping to spot her. In meetings, when they spoke of courage, he remembered her standing up to everyone, sitting in the front row, defying laughter. At night, in the windows of his tall buildings, the memory of her eyes haunted him. It was as if he had lost something he hadn't even known he needed, and the discomfort grew. He began to ask discreet questions. He learned she had requested temporary leave from classes. Some teachers commented in hushed tones that the humiliation had crossed the line. Others simply shook their heads silently, as if ashamed of having watched and done nothing. He understood, in that instant, that it wasn't just about his classmates' cruelty. It was about him, about his silence. The girl had disappeared because, even when he had the chance to defend her definitively, he hesitated, and that hesitation had cost him dearly. The more days passed, the more restless he found himself, like a man surrounded by invisible walls. No party, trip, speech, or contract signing could free him from the feeling of loss. For the first time, the millionaire experienced loss, not the lack of things one could buy, but the lack of someone who represented something greater. It was as if in her absence he had lost himself, the most human reflection that still existed within his own story. What others called a poor girl who gave up, he now understood as something else: a silence full of meaning, a distance that was both an accusation and a lesson. And in this growing emptiness, the millionaire began to feel the pain of longing. A longing that was not for memories lived with her, but for what could have been if he had done things differently. For the first time in a long time he felt powerless, and that powerlessness would be the beginning of his true transformation. The millionaire, who until then seemed untouchable, began to feel the tide turning against him. Her absence was like a constant echo, but the outside world, which had previously applauded his every move, was beginning to question. In the university corridors, the narrative spreading was no longer about the girl's courage, but about his cowardice. Professors whispered that his intervention on stage had been nothing more than a cheap marketing ploy. Students commented online that it hadn't been inspiration, but manipulation. He wanted to use her to appear human, some said, in videos that quickly went viral. Others went further. If he really believed in her, why didn't he do anything when everyone humiliated her afterward? His silence, once seen as a firm stance, was now interpreted as complicity. His image as a modern hero, the visionary investor who spoke of courage and resilience, began to crack. Newspapers that had previously extolled him began publishing critical articles questioning his motivations. Opinion blogs called him a fraud. What should have been a moment of greatness became his greatest weakness. At a business event, a young man dared to ask on camera, "How can you talk so much about resilience and merit, but ignore the humiliation of the weakest when it's right in front of you?" The audience fell silent. He, accustomed to sharp answers, felt disarmed. He responded with vague phrases, but the tension had already been registered. The video spread like wildfire across social media. With each passing day, the pressure mounted. Business partners began to express discomfort, investors questioning his credibility. It was as if the world had decided to expose his flaw, reminding him that no amount of wealth could buy genuine respect. Deep down, he knew it wasn't others who condemned him. It was the truth itself coming to light, revealing the contradiction between public discourse and private choices. At night, alone in his luxurious penthouse, he relived the scenes from the diner, the laughter, her expression as she faced it all in silence. Now he realized that every second he hadn't acted had been a sentence against him. The weight of this social judgment came not just from without, but from within. For the first time, he experienced what the girl had always known, what it means to be the target of collective contempt. Only in his case it was even worse, because he was fueled by the exposed hypocrisy. With each new criticism, he felt as if his fortune was losing value. Invitations for interviews became fewer. The glances at social events grew colder. He, who had always been the center of attention, now experienced the bitter taste of isolation. And silently, he understood. Life had decided to balance the scales. The humiliation he hadn't prevented against her now turned against him, multiplied, as if fate had found the most precise way to teach him what he never wanted to learn. Criticism was no longer just passing headlines or anonymous comments on social media. It became part of his routine, a constant mirror reflecting his hypocrisy. The once untouchable millionaire began to withdraw. He cancelled interviews, avoided events, and reduced his public appearances. The man who had always walked erect, surrounded by flashbulbs, now walked through the hallways with heavier steps, as if every glance were an accusation. In the silence of his luxurious penthouse, surrounded by glass walls that revealed a vibrant city, he felt the painful contrast between the world outside and the emptiness within. His marble desk, strewn with million-dollar contracts, no longer brought him pride. His closet, crammed with expensive suits, felt suffocating. Even the wine that used to celebrate victories now tasted of defeat. For the first time, he began to revisit his past unfiltered, without the victorious mask he had learned to wear. He remembered the hunger he'd felt, the nights he'd wondered if he could pay the rent, the kind hands that had once offered him a hot meal and words of encouragement. The girl's mother wasn't just a memory, she was the root of everything he'd become. And now, faced with her daughter, he realized how far he'd strayed from the man he'd promised to be. With each criticism he received, instead of anger, he felt shame. It was as if life was stripping away layers of pride to expose the vulnerability he'd hidden from himself. He began walking the city streets without bodyguards, trying to regain contact with the reality he'd lost. He observed exhausted workers on the subway, children playing in poor neighborhoods, mothers balancing bags and hope. Every ordinary face reminded him of her, the girl who, even humiliated, carried in her eyes the dignity that not all the millions in the world could buy. One sleepless night, he opened the drawer where he kept old papers and found a faded photograph, himself, younger, sitting at the table in the small house where his mother had taken him in. In the background, a girl with braids watched curiously. It was her, still a child, never imagining that one day their paths would cross again. The impact was devastating. The tears he had always refused to give in flowed freely. For the first time, he wasn't crying over material loss, but over the discovery of how much he had lost of himself. In the silence of that early morning, he swore to himself that he wouldn't let the story end like this. Transformation wouldn't come from prepared speeches or investments in image, but from a real gesture, a reunion he needed not only to redeem himself, but to reconnect with the essence he had abandoned on the path to wealth. The millionaire everyone knew was beginning to die, and in his place emerged, still fragile, the man who finally understood that dignity can't be bought, it can be recognized. Their reunion didn't take place in a brightly lit auditorium, nor at a grand event surrounded by cameras. Life, with its silent irony, preferred a more human setting. It was in a public library, one of those that smell of old paper and respectful silence, that he saw her again. She was sitting alone, surrounded by open books, her face illuminated by the yellow desk lamp, her loose hair falling over her shoulders. There was no audience, no laughter, no betting, just her lost in the world of words, as if seeking refuge there from all her wounds. The millionaire paused at the door for a few seconds, unable to move. He felt the weight of all the memories, of all the wrong choices, and at the same time a deep fear that he wasn't even worthy of approaching. But his steps betrayed him, and soon she noticed his presence. She raised her eyes slowly, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. The silence between them said more than 1,000 sentences could. She didn't smile, didn't show surprise. She simply stared at him with the firmness of someone who had learned not to be destabilized. He, in turn, felt his throat dry, his voice catching. He walked to the table, stopped in front of her and took a deep breath before saying, "I looked for you." She slowly closed the book in front of her, as if preparing her heart for the battle she knew was coming. "And why?" she asked, her tone unchanged. There was no anger. There only a cutting calm that disarmed him. He pulled out the chair next to her but hesitated to sit. "Because I needed to see you. Because I know who you are." Her gaze narrowed, but she didn't answer. She just waited. Then, with a choked voice, he said her mother's name. A simple name, yet loaded with memories that echoed in the silent space like an inevitable revelation. Her eyes shone for a moment, betraying the surprise she was trying to contain. "You knew my mother?" she asked. He nodded and finally sat down as if the gesture were a confession. "She helped me when I had nothing. When everyone turned their backs on me, it was your mother who believed in me. If I'm here today, I owe it to her. And now, I find you, her daughter, living the same humiliations I should have prevented." His hands trembled slightly, and the weight of his words wasn't theatrical, but raw, real. She remained silent for a few long seconds, absorbing every syllable. Part of her wanted to believe. Him, another part feared it was just another act. "And why only now?" she finally asked. "Why did you let everyone laugh, let them belittle me, when you could have stopped it from the start?" He lowered his eyes, unable to hold them. "Because I was a coward too. Because I became what I despised most, someone who hides behind their own wealth. I wasn't ready to face the debt I carried, but now I am." Silence filled the space again. She watched him, trying to decipher if there was truth in those words. Deep down, she knew there was. The weight of confession is not something one can make up, but she also knew the decision wouldn't be simple. The reunion wasn't a happy ending. It was merely the opening of a wound that would need to be healed, with caution, time, perhaps even distance. Yet for the first time she saw in that man not the distant millionaire, but the broken reflection of someone who, like her, knew the bitter taste of humiliation. and that, in itself, changed everything. The silence between them in the library seemed endless, an abyss separating two lives that fate had cruelly and inevitably crossed. He, carrying the belated shame of someone who recognizes a mistake when there's no way to erase it. She, with the weight of all her open wounds, trying to decide whether to reach out or close the door forever. The millionaire watched her with contained anxiety, waiting for a word, a gesture, any sign that would give her a chance. But she was in no hurry. The rush was his, not hers. Finally, the young woman took a deep breath, crossed her arms on the table, and spoke calmly, without raising her voice, but with the firmness of someone who has learned to defend herself. You talk about debt. You say you owe everything to my mother, but where were you when they turned me into a joke? Where were you when they laughed at me in front of everyone? You watched. You knew who I was, and yet you remained silent. And now you come seeking redemption. I am not currency. Do not settle your guilt. The words fell like stones, and he, who had always controlled situations, lowered his head, unable to respond immediately. She continued, I don't want your money, nor your promises. What I want is something you may not be able to give, respect. Not through speeches on a stage, but through silent actions when no one is looking, because that's when the truth emerges. The pain in her voice wasn't anger, but deep disappointment. And that struck him more than any scream. He finally raised his tearful eyes and said simply, If you'll allow me, I want to prove that I can be different. She shook her head with a bitter smile. It's not me who needs that proof. It's you. She stood slowly, gathering up the books, as if closing that chapter between them as well. The millionaire tried to speak, but she held up her hand, begging for silence. Don't follow me. I need to decide for myself if there's still room for you in my story. For now, the answer is no. Those last words fell like a verdict. He felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The girl walked away with firm steps, leaving behind not only the library but also his last defense against the void. Yet, there was something different about that farewell. It wasn't hatred she left behind, but the opportunity for transformation. By refusing, she didn't destroy him. On the contrary, she gave him the weight of a choice. Now it was up to him to change, not to win her over, but to prove to himself that he could still be someone worthy of the legacy of the woman who had once saved him. And that was perhaps the cruelest and most just form of justice, offering him not an immediate end, but the uncertainty of a new beginning. Winter had arrived in the city, and the snow fell slowly, covering the streets in white, silencing the urban chaos. The millionaire walked alone, without security, without flashing lights, just a man in the cold. He passed in front of the campus and saw, leaning against the same wall, where he had stood so many times, a simple bicycle now covered in a thin layer of snow. He stopped in front of it, touched the icy handlebars with his gloved hands, and remained silent, as if the bicycle were an altar to what he had lost. In the distance, almost obscured by the morning mist, he saw her. The young woman walked slowly, her books pressed to her chest, her scarf covering part of her face. She didn't see him. She didn't need to. His gaze said it all. He didn't call out to her, didn't chase after her. He simply remained motionless, watching her move away down the snow-covered street like a vision from another world. When she disappeared around the bend, he closed his eyes and smiled for the first time in weeks, a small smile, bittersweet and yet liberating. There was pain in that gesture, but also an acceptance. Some stories don't end in encounters, but in silent transformations. Without witnesses, without applause, without explanation, he removed his gloves and let his bare hand rest on the cold bicycle seat, feeling the roughness of the worn fabric. Snow fell on his shoulders, weighing him down, but he didn't move. It was his form of respect, his silent promise, his penance. And so he remained, motionless in the cold, while the city awakened around him, carrying in his chest not the certainty of a happy ending, but the weight and beauty of a lesson that only silence could teach. If you've made it this far, tell me in the comments. What would you do in her place? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Like this post, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories, and click on the next video that's showing on your screen right now. I'm sure you'll get even more goosebumps.